Hey guys, Larry the tractor guy here real quick. I've got a customer with an 8430 that's called in with an oil leak on the ILS, and he says it's leaking from the ILS cylinder on the right hand side of this 8430. And we're gonna take a look at that real quick, see if we can figure something out for him before it gets too hot. Man, it's been like 100+ degrees out here in southwest Oklahoma every day. And so we've been trying to get out early and get some of these calls wrapped up before it gets super hot. And so we've started this tractor and ran it a little bit, and I've seen this before on these ILS suspension systems. So ILS is independent link suspension, and so there's 2 cylinders on the front of this suspension system that gives this tractor suspension on the front end. And so it's got 4 accumulators that are charged with nitrogen, the rod end and the barrel end of the cylinder. And it looks like it's leaking around the barrel end of the right cylinder, which is welded to the barrel, okay? And I think what's causing that is his accumulators have lost their nitrogen charge. So looking into Service Advisor, we found that you should check the charge, check the pressure on the upper and the lower accumulators every 1,500 hours or annually, whichever comes first. Most of our guys out in this area, they don't put that many hours, 1,500 hours a year on tractors. So just keep in mind, it's a good idea to have those accumulators checked every year so that you don't have these cylinder failures. And I'll show you what I'm talking about, give you an idea of what's going on here. So here's our right hand ILS cylinder. And if you can see, you've got a lower link here and an upper link here, okay? And I'm gonna try to get in here where you can see. So our leakage is right in this area, okay? It looks like we've got a crack or maybe a little pinhole at the top of this weld where this barrel is welded onto this head, or the head welded onto the barrel. And I've seen these crack before, and so I'm gonna wipe that off. And I suspect that there's probably a little bit of a crack right in that area. Okay, and so what's happening here is this tractor is riding rigid in the field, and so it doesn't has very little suspension on the front end, because I'm pretty sure we've lost our nitrogen charge in our accumulators. So we're probably going to have to go ahead and replace this cylinder. I've had some guys ask before if you could weld the top of that cylinder. And I suppose you probably could find a welder that was good enough to weld that into that cylinder, but it would be pretty dangerous to weld that and then actually have a failure of that cylinder. So I think it's a better idea to replace the cylinder. And so we're going to probably go ahead and replace that cylinder this morning and take a look at these accumulators. So to replace this cylinder, we're going to have to remove this shield underneath and the valve cover right here underneath, so that we can relieve the pressure on this front suspension. Okay, we have to relieve that pressure, which is going to allow the tractor to drop down pretty close to the ground. Well, not really on the ground, but it's going to let these relieve the pressure on these cylinders basically before we can change this right hand cylinder. Taking a look up in here, if you can see this T-handle valve right here. Okay, this is kind of the sort of the old style ILS valve, since it's on a 30 series front wheel assist tractor rather than an R. On an R, we've got 2 different valves to relieve. On the old style ILS valve, we just got this T-handle valve, and so we're going to crack that open. And when we crack that needle valve open, that T-handle, it's going to allow us to relieve the pressure on these ILS cylinders. Okay, and so be mindful when you do that you're not in any position underneath the tractor where the tractor would come down on top of you. So I typically like to just kind of break that loose and make sure it's loose, and then make sure that I'm sort of out of the way to the side of the tractor when I relieve that pressure.
About like that?
Yep, about like that. Now if you'll come around to this side and stand up over here and reach under there with one hand and go ahead and open that valve up.
There it goes.
Okay, go ahead and open it up. Okay.
Let it all the way down?
Yeah, let it all the way down, so it's relieving the pressure on our suspension cylinders there. Okay, just leave it open.
Okay.
Okay, so we basically relieve the pressure on the cylinders. So now we need to get a jack and jack the front of the tractor up, at least on this right side, to relieve the pressure off of the upper and the lower suspension arm. So we're going to get our jack out and jack that up, and then we'll talk about removing this cylinder. Got our jack underneath the tractor, and we jack that up just enough to relieve the pressure and the weight off of the ILS cylinder so that we can remove and replace the cylinder. You have to remove this top hose off of that fitting to get it out of the way, to clear the bolt and the washer that holds the cylinder on. So the bottom of the cylinder, the top is pretty loose on the pin. The bottom one is pretty well stuck, okay? And so we've lubed it up and we've kind of hammered on it and beat on it, and we can't get it loose. And so we're going to you can take any old bolt I always like to use a bolt that's a little bit smaller than the threads of the pin, and just slide it in there as something to push against. And so we're going to install this handy little posi lock puller and see if we can't put a pull on that and pull that bushing, that ball joint in that cylinder off of that pin on this lower suspension link. Got our puller installed, got us a pusher bolt in the pin there on the bottom link, and Caleb's gonna tighten this up a little bit, see if we can put a little pull on this puller. We had our puller in position, we had our pusher bolt in there, okay, and the jack bolt on our puller was walking off of our pusher bolt. And so I'm going to show you a real quick little trick, and you may already know this, but I'm going to show you anyway. You can see where our jack bolt was walking off the side of the head of that bolt that we're using to push with. And so I'm going to take and drill a little hole right in the center of that bolt. Okay, and then I'm gonna go to a larger bit and keep stepping my way up until I know that the jack bolt on my puller will set in that drilled out spot on this bolt that we're using for a pusher. That'll work a little bit better than just fighting that walking off of that puller. See what we did? We just drilled a small little hole there, and I'll show you what that looks like on our puller. That'll sort of set right in that hole and keep our puller from walking off. Basically pulled the ball joint here completely out of the back side of the cylinder. This ILS cylinder has pretty well fought us all the way. It's getting hot out here. We're probably up around, I don't know, say it's probably 95 degrees. At least we got a little bit of breeze. So we're either gonna have to try to torch that out of there with a cutting torch, or we're gonna try to put another pull on it with the puller just on the bushing and the ball joint and see if we can pull it that way. We talked about this a little bit. It sure would be nice to go ahead and get the cutting torch and cut that off of there. We might put a pull on it, put a little bit of heat on it, but man, as you can see, it's so dry out here in southwest Oklahoma. Everything is dead. Now we've got wind blowing, and we really don't want to get that cutting torch fired up and start a fire out here, especially with the wind blowing out of the southwest, and we could have pretty good fire going here, and maybe not enough water with us to put it out. So I think we probably better just put a pull on it with a puller, and we might apply a little heat to it, see if we can get it off that way. We're gonna take a die grinder cut-off wheel, and we're gonna try to put a cross cut in what's left of this bottom ball joint bushing, okay? And see if we can't split it in half that way and get it off of there without using a torch. So we cut a pretty good groove across that bushing, and now we can drive that punch in there, and you can see it's loose now And so we're gonna be able to get that off of there fairly easy now. So we sort of did that without having to fire up the torch. So stay tuned and we'll put the new cylinder on and show you what it looks like. We got our new cylinder in place here. Go ahead and install these long tie bolts here that hold the cylinder in place, and we'll get everything hooked up, and we'll shut our bleed screw on our valve underneath, our needle valve off, and then we'll go ahead and bleed that ILS cylinder. So we got our cylinder, our ILS cylinder on the right side installed. After we had a lot of trouble removing the cylinder, we finally got the new cylinder on and got everything installed. And really, reading through Service Advisor, there's not an ideal or like a specific way to bleed the air out of that ILS cylinder other than running the tractor, but there is the option to run a calibration. And during calibration, when you switch to calibration, it allows you to raise and lower the front suspension using the #1 selective control valve. Okay, and so I basically went into tech mode and then went to the SFA controller at address 20 here on the display, and at address 20 we can enter into the calibration mode. Okay, and it pops up the #1 SCV, if you can see there, and then also it locks our SCVs on our hydraulic display here. Okay, and so now I can use the #1 SCV switch. I didn't realize at first because I kind of forgot, but you have to detent forward to lower the front end, if you can see that, lowering the front cylinder, and then detent rearward to raise the ILS cylinder. Okay, and so you can do that as many times as you want. Essentially, you can do that as many times as you want to bleed the air out. Okay, and so that's all I'm doing, is just detenting forward and detenting it rearward on the #1 SCV, and it's lowering and raising the front suspension cylinders on the tractor, which I think that's a pretty good way to bleed the air out of a new cylinder. If you want to go ahead and calibrate, which we will, we'll go ahead and completely lower the front suspension. Okay, and then we'll go and hit next here, enter. Okay, and then it's going to save all of our calibration settings there. Okay, now we're at the done and back to iCal. So we're going to go ahead and calibrate again using the #1 SCV. Okay, so we're going to calibrate, and we're going to leave the tractor at the point in which we want it to be. So we're going to go up and down, and come back up to about midway, about right there. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and hit enter, end of calibration. It's going to save those settings. We're going to go ahead and drive the tractor around the field here and see what our ILS looks like as far as suspension. We don't have gauges with us this afternoon to actually check the nitrogen in the accumulators, but we're going to go ahead and drive the tractor and see what it looks like here. So I'm going to speed up, if you can kind of watch that suspension, and then I'm going to hit the clutch and stop real quick. And as you can see, we really don't have any suspension at all on the front of this tractor. So that's a pretty quick indication there that we've got accumulators that are low or lost their charge of nitrogen. And so in my mind, if we've lost nitrogen in our top and bottom accumulators on the tractor, then we probably have a problem with an accumulator. And so I've talked to the customer, and as soon as they get done with the tractor, they're going to bring it into the shop, and then we'll go ahead and check the nitrogen charge on the top and lower accumulators. Just a real quick recap on the 8430 tractor with the ILS cylinder leaking, the right hand independent link suspension cylinder with the leak or the crack around the welded end on the cylinder. I believe that's a result of losing our nitrogen in our accumulators. And so I've got a video out there about charging accumulators. If you'll want to look at that, you can just go to Larry the Tractor Guy and you'll find us charging the accumulators on an 8R tractor, which is pretty well similar to the 8430. We're going to bring this tractor in at a later date, talk to the customer, and we're going to bring it in a later date and go ahead and charge those accumulators for him and see if we got a bad accumulator and maybe even install a new accumulator. And so Larry the Tractor Guy signing out. Hey guys, check out Larry the Tractor Guy videos here, other videos here, subscribe here, and buy all your John Deere parts here.
We'll make it work. I think
We're gonna have to make it
we'll make it work. Come on, let's go.
We need to make
You need some food.
Y'all already burned me out.
Some bloopers.
He's sitting in the sun over here, man.